In the Istanbul dawn of 1623, a heavy mist lingered over the sleeping city's stone streets. Behind the gold-plated walls of Topkapı Palace, a nightmare was slowly coming to life, one that would never be etched into the pages of history. According to whispers, the shriek that tore through the marble corridors came not from the noise of war, but from the slender throat of a 15-year-old princess. Princess Fatma Sultan, a sapling born from the blood of power and glory, but with a destiny sealed by dark shadows. Her screams, a lament of fear and supplication mixed together, echoed in the depths of the palace. That echo was so bone-chilling that even the eunuchs, who had grown accustomed to horror, turned their faces to the darkness. Because this sound was like the groan of a phantom that hollowed out a person's soul. Historians remained silent, but the whispers continued to circulate behind the dark walls. Those whispers spoke of a secret ritual that shattered the minds of young sultan princesses before their bodies when they reached marriageable age. Behind silk curtains and rose-filled gardens, a curse was hidden beneath the mask of lust and splendor. And it was said that the empire had invented a protocol crueler than its enemies could ever imagine. This protocol would seal the souls of young brides, turning them into beings married to shadows while still alive. Darkness and splendor met under the same palace roof. A secret that history books never wrote was sealed with blood. The pens of historians fell silent. No line ever mentioned these dark ceremonies. But in the memory of the people, the belief that the glittering ceremonies in reality concealed a horror woven with shadows remained alive. Centuries later, some writers claim to have seen documents hidden in Istanbul's forbidden archives. These documents revealed what shadows danced behind the light on the wedding nights of Ottoman princesses. Was it a fact or a cunning fantasy? It is unknown, but the stories sent a chill to the souls of those who heard them. While peasants and noble women dreamed of palace life, the fate of the imperial heirs became nightmares disguised as splendor. This was not a fairy tale, but a lament woven from the threads of power and fear. The daughters of the marble palaces were not envied, as everyone thought. On the contrary, most rumors whisper that they preferred the cold silence of the grave to the fate awaiting them behind the wedding door. And the Ottomans, for more than 6 centuries, it spread in waves like a sea without borders. It cast its shadow over 3 continents. From its birth in 1299 to its collapse in 1922, it was one of the most powerful and ruthless machines on the stage of history. Its armies, marching with iron discipline, carried death and glory from the stone walls of Vienna to the hot sands of Yemen. The fall of Istanbul in 1453 was not just the conquest of a city. At that moment, the known face of the world was shattered and reshaped. As Byzantium was buried in the shadows of history, Istanbul became the center of an empire that pulsed with the rhythm of a dark heart. And right in the middle of this heart, Topkapı Palace rose like a jewel gleaming with its marble walls. Although the scent of roses lingered in its gardens, blood, intrigue, and whispers had accumulated at its roots. Because behind the golden gates of the palace, not only wars and throne struggles were sealed, but also the silent tragedies of those born with royal blood. Eunuchs with emotionless eyes waited at these gates. The Harem, another city hidden within a city, a labyrinth woven with rules, where once 800 women lived and even breaths were calculated. There, every gaze, every step, every breath slowly fell onto the scales of destiny. After the 1530s, with the unprecedented titles bestowed upon Harem Sultan by Suleiman the Magnificent, the harem was no longer a pleasure garden, but a stage for silent wars, intrigues, and secret alliances in the shadows of couches. Most of the women were Christian slaves taken from distant lands. Some were chained on battlefields. Some were bought from the dark corners of distant markets. And all of them entered the palace with a single dream: to gain the sultan's gaze, to turn their servitude into influence and power. But in the palace, power was hidden in the sweet melodies of music, in the patiently embroidered patterns of needlework, in the deceptive verses of poems, and most importantly, in the bloody rituals of obedience. Because within the harem, every smile could be a weapon, every gesture a judgment, and every breath a destiny. By a strange twist of fate, the concubines brought to the palace with slave chains sometimes had a broader range of movement than the sultan's own daughters. They could rise from the shadows to reach the pinnacle of power. But the princesses, they were often just pawns on the cold table of diplomacy, being sacrificed through marriage to seal loyalty or to extinguish the fire of rebellion. And within this iron cage woven by splendor and oppression, the Sultanate of Women would last from 1533 to 1656. Powerful figures surrounded by shadows, like Kozum Sultan and Turhan Hadisi Sultan, wielded such great authority that even the Janissaries, considered the most fearsome force of the empire, would shudder at their whispers. Yet, although concubine queens rising from the harem could shape the fate of the empire, the palace princesses were chained to an even crueler fate. The luster of their lineage was also their shackles. The moment they were born, they were sealed to be sacrificed for the sake of power. Under the mask of golden thrones, magnificent feasts, and showy embassies, a machine of submission was operating that no one dared to speak of out loud. And in the center of this silent mechanism, a name was waiting that would circulate in whispers for centuries: Fatma Sultan. Fatma opened her eyes to the world in 1606. Her father, the powerful Sultan Ahmed I, her mother, one of the most powerful women the empire had ever seen, the Queen of Shadows, Kozum Sultan. Fatma's childhood passed in the fragrant gardens and marble courtyards of Topkapı. But even among the roses, the ominous shadow of the approaching storm lingered. Though the sweet gurgle of fountains mingled with the sound of lutes and poets, the dark murmur of the destiny awaiting her behind the walls never ceased. The pens of historians wrote her name with respect. Fatma Sultan was a girl who spoke 4 languages, wrote with the delicacy of a calligrapher, studied the heavens, and had the courage to debate law and history with scholars. For poets, she was a dazzling jewel of the dynasty, a gift that brought together intelligence, beauty, and nobility in one body. But within the shadows of the palace, no brilliance, no talent could protect a girl from the destiny sealed at her birth. Because every sultan's daughter was born to be sacrificed on the scales of power. Their names were etched onto the cold strategy ledgers of the empire in silent and inevitable letters. Fatma's name had already been written. What awaited her was not a young nobleman or a fairy tale hero. It was a commander 20 years her senior, shaped by blood and wars, Kara Mustafa Pasha. For him, this marriage was a key that would open the door to power. For Fatma, it was the first act of a tragedy. And the most painful part was this. Even her mother, the Queen of Shadows, the master of intrigue, Kozum Sultan, could not protect her from the approaching storm. Rumors speak of a dark preparation known as Turville and Mubarak. Although it seemed like a sacred education from the outside, it was actually a secret ceremony invented to break her pride, shatter her soul, and accustom the girls to submission before they were handed over to their future husbands. And in this ceremony, the old maid-in-waiting, Gulnar Hatton, supervised. The bridal chamber was no longer a school, but had turned into a dungeon. For days, Fatma memorized the angles of bowing, her hands always down, and practiced walking with measured steps. Even the words that came out of her mouth were chained. Only these 4 words remained on her tongue: gratitude, apology, acceptance, supplication. The whispers of witnesses tell that even the slightest mistake was punished by a shortened fast or imprisonment in closed rooms. But the darkest whispers were about the rehearsals for the wedding night. Talim and Herdic were practiced in underground rooms where wax figures made by Venetian masters waited. If these stories are true, Fatma was forced to learn gestures that no adolescent should know. The slightest sign of resistance was recorded in secret ledgers. Whether it's true or a cruel exaggeration is unknown. But later historians always emphasized that princesses were not subjected to such rituals anywhere else in the palace. What is certain is that the last months she spent preparing for marriage were full of humiliation and subjugation. Rumors say she was forced to serve her father's concubines, to wash them, dress them, and prepare them for their meetings with the Sultan. Some say Fatma trembled while adjusting their veils, unable to hold back her tears. Every movement was planned to crush her pride before the wedding day arrived. A week before the wedding, Fatma was moved to the Helen Cuckoo, or bridal pavilion. This was an isolated place where every aspect of her life was controlled like iron. From that moment on, what she ate, what she drank, what she thought no longer belonged to her. Her nutrition was the red power of pomegranate, the sweet weight of honey, the touch of goat's milk and almond, and a mixture of spicy elixirs with shadows. Some claim that these mixtures, prepared by alchemists trained in Cordoba and Samarkand, contained secret substances to calm her soul and make her obedient. Some dismissed these as mere gossip, but their effect was undeniable. Fatma slowly slipped into a strange state of acceptance. Every sip, every bite was a silent reminder of an invisible chain. The body no longer belonged to her. Even bathing turned into torture. Under the cold eyes of the maids-in-waiting, she was submerged in waters scented with poppy, valerian, and asafoetida oils. The water, which was supposed to be refreshing, had turned into a ritual of subjugation. Every cleansing motion was presented as a purification rite for her future husband. Witnesses later described this as a scene where a sacred act turned into an invisible chain. Water had become the empire's absolute claim over her skin. The walls of the pavilion also whispered the same story. The tapestries showed scenes where obedient wives were praised for their fertility and submission. For Fatma, there were silent models, ghosts she had to imitate. Phoenician mirrors were placed in such a way that it was impossible for her to escape her own reflection. The practice of muraqabah, which once had its roots in Sufi meditation, was turned into a weapon for Fatma. She was constantly forced to watch herself, as if even her shadow had become a guard that imprisoned her. Her education shifted from poetry and astronomy to the dark books of obedience. The palace presented her with chapters from Nazihat al-Muluk and other treatises, praising loyalty and sacrifice as a sacred duty. Day by day, she repeated these verses aloud in front of the concubines and eunuchs. Prayers were no longer personal supplications either. They had become formulas that exalted loyalty to the husband as a sacred command, not to God. Every word, every breath, worked like a spell to accustom her soul to slavery. Even religion had turned into a rehearsal for her submission. Humiliation had now permeated every fabric of her daily life. Twice a week, she was ordered to serve her father's concubines. The message of the ritual was clear. Even her father's mistresses stood above her. She felt her own value fading in the shadows of the palace. The price of resistance was cruel. A rebellious gaze meant being forced to fast. A sigh of disgust could send her to damp and dark reflection cells. Silence and darkness would shatter her soul even further. The slightest mistake during bowing or prayer was practiced over and over in front of the female court. It would continue until exhaustion wiped away her will. Records or later whispers note that every progress was recorded as if she were taking an exam. But there was no reward. It was only certain that the training would continue until it had completely shaped her. When she reached this point, those who knew her said her voice began to disappear. She was no longer just silent out of fear. She had become unable to find words. The brilliant young woman who once debated with scholars had now almost turned into a shadow, a silhouette reflected on the palace walls, disappearing in the shadow of all her splendor. Her identity had been emptied within the cold and shadowy walls of the pavilion. A week before the wedding, her isolation reached its darkest point. Cut off from all the sounds of the outside world, Fatma lived in a routine regulated like a clock designed to completely erase her under constant surveillance. She was fed with purifying foods, washed with sacred oils, and surrounded by tapestries depicting obedient wives and inescapable mirrors. Every gaze, every reflection imprisoned her in her own dungeon. She finally realized that her voice, her body, and her dreams were no longer hers. The young girl who once mapped the stars had become a silent vessel of obedience and submission. Ahmed's daughter, that bright young woman known for her intelligence and soul, was now a suppressed shadow, preparing for the most terrifying night of her life, an unstoppable nightmare. And the appointed day came, March 15th, 1623. From dawn, Istanbul trembled with the eerie rhythm of ceremonies. The streets were filled with processions, the scent of incense and burning wood thickened in the air, and melodies and instruments from distant provinces echoed in the city. War drums clashed with the strings of lutes, and palace courtyards glittered with magnificent feasts served on golden trays. The chroniclers narrate that Persian dancers and Andalusian musicians livened up the halls, and janissaries performed their marches before the Sultan's eyes. For the people, this was a festival, a reverence to the heavens. But for Fatma, this was the pulse of disaster, the drum beat of ruin and despair of the inevitable end. The palace physicians had noticed the alarming signs. Fatma drank little water. Her lips were chapped. She trembled and sweated despite the light spring breeze. Today we would call this a panic attack, but at that time, it was recorded with the vague label of virgin melancholy. Guests raised their glasses. Music filled the corridors, but she remained silent, staring into space like a haunted ghost. When the feast ended and the visitors left, the most feared procession began. The princess was led to the octagonal bridal pavilion that rose in the palace garden. Formally, this place symbolized purity, submission, and unity. But in the whispers of the eunuchs and maids-in-waiting, it had become a much darker temple. Some swore that the structure was a labyrinth where obedience was tested. Each room was dedicated to a different ritual. In reality, Fatma was washed with rose water and sandalwood, her body anointed with oils. This was a traditional practice. But according to rumors, there were also stronger and darker potions. Drops of opium that numbed resistance, even mandrake. She had a dress of white silk, adorned with golden embroidery. It was weighed down with pearls and precious stones. From the outside, it was a picture of splendor, but according to whispers, the weight and layers of the dress turned it into a prison, forcing her body into immobility. Meanwhile, Kara Mustafa Pasha was kept separate, receiving advice from old counselors on the methods he should approach. Some narratives claim he was trained in gestures of intimidation and dominance, as if he were preparing for a campaign. Whether it's true or a rumor is unknown, but it reveals how darkly politics and the marriage bed were intertwined. And finally, the bride was led to the consummation room. Every step was the echo of a silent ritual of horror. Every breath was the cold melody of a subjugating fate. The walls were covered with dark tapestries depicting conquests and victories. This union was not just a personal event, but a testament to the dynasty's power. The chroniclers narrate that the maids-in-waiting always waited nearby, eavesdropping, not allowing anything to hinder this terrifying rite. For them, this union was a symbol of the empire's stability. For Fatma, this was the cold and silent beginning of ruin. Witnesses recorded that her voice had almost turned into a whisper, her body trembling with fear and despair. Some narratives speak of fainting spells and bleeding. They describe this in a coded language as the separation of her soul from her body. Whether it's a fact or an exaggeration is unknown, but the picture is clear. She spent that night in silent captivity, her soul withdrawing to survive. The following days revealed the traces of her transformation. Palace physicians recorded the symptoms of what we would call severe trauma today: silence, loss of appetite, sudden outbursts of tears, and uncontrollable violent reactions to the presence of men. Even trusted maids-in-waiting were helpless. Remedies were tried, herbal infusions, resounding music, Sufi meditations. But nothing could bring back her once brilliant mind and soul. The young woman who once debated astronomy with scholars and breathed with music in the palace gardens had now become a shadow of silence and fear. Her once radiant presence was like a ghost lost in the palace's dark walls. The books remained unopened for a long time. The instruments were covered with thick layers of dust, and her laughter, the joy that once echoed in the palace gardens, had completely vanished. The marriage continued only as a duty. Children were born, magnificent ceremonies were held, but in private life, a cold silence reigned. Everything was outwardly orderly but soulless. Later memoirs whisper that Mustafa Pasha even sought escapes, trying to find an outlet in campaigns and opium. Aware of the devastating effect the wedding night had left on his wife, he had only performed his public duties. Fatma appeared as an adorned figure at ceremonies, but there was emptiness in her eyes, and her soul was gone. As the years passed, the bright light of her youth never returned. The chroniclers recorded, her voice faded, her laughter completely disappeared, and according to doctors' reports, she struggled with fevers, fainting spells, and heart palpitations that worsened on wedding anniversaries. That night, the night of consummation, which had once meant a union and celebration, had become for some eyes the beginning of a lifetime of silence, darkness, and a chained soul for Fatma. The magnificent walls surrounding the palace were silent witnesses to her inner prison. Every moment the light shone was a moment her shadow deepened. Ahmed I's daughter, Fatma, once praised for her intelligence and brilliance, turned into a silent shadow within the palace walls. Although the empire praised her marriage as a triumph, it never saw the dark price of her private life. In public, she was a wife and mother who knew her duty. She appeared at feasts, rituals, and ceremonies, fulfilling the role imposed upon her. But behind closed doors, memoirs whisper that she struggled with sleepless nights and sudden outbursts of tears. The splendor of the palace, the jewels, music, and feasts stood in sharp contrast to the darkness within her. Every golden tray and sparkling jewel made the chains of her soul visible. Kara Mustafa Pasha, despite being respected in the military field, could never erase the cold distance between him and his wife. Later writings tell that he sought refuge in long campaigns and opium. Perhaps he could not face the shadow he had created. Their marriage became a mechanical arrangement, bound only by politics and duty. Fatma lived like a silent shadow for nearly 30 years after that terrifying night. In 1652, the palace physicians recorded her death from brain fever. But some whisperers say it was no coincidence that this date was the exact day of her wedding anniversary. The story spreads. Fatma's soul was broken long before her body began to decay. The splendor of the palace was the silent witness to her broken soul. Every golden wall, every bright stone, carried the echo of a secret tragedy. And Fatma was not alone. In the archives, dusty and forgotten records show that many Ottoman princesses shared similar dark fates. Some were buried in silence. Their names did not even echo in the stone walls of the palace after they were married. Others were completely erased from official records, as if they had never existed. Historians express suspicions of suicide or madness for some, but the chroniclers embellish this with vague euphemisms, illness, or withdrawal. Whispers tell that some princesses embroidered codes and threads to send secret messages to their brothers. Some, in a rare but brave way, dared to ask for permission to divorce. Some narratives even say that a few faked their own deaths to escape an unwanted second marriage. Whether it's true or a fantasy is unknown, but the despair of palace life is evident in every line. The tales the empire adorned with silk and crowns often concealed a dark and painful truth. Ottoman princesses were not just symbols of luxury and privilege. They were political pawns with no control over their lives. Their voices, silenced by protocols, had become the first victims of power. Fatma's tragedy reveals that dynastic triumph was often built on the broken souls of the women who carried it. And the inevitable question arises: how many stories are still waiting in the dark in the sealed archives of the palaces? How many princesses lived in silence, died in silence? Their names are remembered only in coded threads and the ominous whispers of the palace. Did Fatma's fate send a shiver down your spine? Then come, let's uncover more hidden history. Let's strip away the silks, the splendor, and the legends one by one. because only then can we hear the silent screams of the women who were sacrificed for the empire.